Welcome to On the Other Hand, and a special welcome to these new subscribers and any other new viewers. I've put out a video on my thoughts on anti-racism, but after making a video covering a local school member getting a pushback for her stance on critical race theory, I wanted to do more of a catch-all video covering critical race theory, or CRT, and its related words, definitions, and meanings. And so you know my bias, I'm an American conservative. I'm going to run through clips and documents discussing these terms: equality, equity, inclusion, intersectionality, microaggressions, anti-racism, white fragility, whiteness, and critical race theory. Let me start with some definitions taken from some diversity documents distributed at workplaces. And to be clear, I'm fine with diversity training. I just don't like people tainting the trainings with critical theory concepts. One of these documents outlined words in an inclusive language guide, and because this is a document all about language, it says, quote, "The language we use can reflect or challenge our biases. Words can bring teams together or tear them apart." I agree, and let's look at some definitions to see some interesting things. First, they define equality as treating everyone the same, often while assuming that everyone also starts out on equal footing or with the same opportunities. Then they define equity as working toward fair outcomes for people or groups by treating them in ways that address their unique advantages or barriers. So, despite how close equality and equity sound, equality is used to talk about equal opportunities, while equity is used to talk about equal outcomes. Keep that in mind. Then we get down to this strawman definition of meritocracy, that they say is a belief in a flawed idea that working hard and talent alone are all that's needed to achieve success. Notice how they use words like flawed, alone, and all. They literally define the term in the worst way to take shots at the idea. A far more reasonable definition would be that hard work and talent are the biggest factors of success. And as for the last definition, we have microaggressions, which are tiny, casual, almost imperceptible insults and degradations often felt by a marginalized group. Now with those definitions in mind, I'd like to flip to another part that talks about how to be an ally, and says that the intent is less important than impact. Taking that back to microaggressions, these definitions of words emphasize that what really matters is how people take words, not what is meant. Finally, in instructions on how to be an ally, it describes that you can be a scholar by, quote, seeking to learn from other people. Makes sense, I'm on board so far. It says to be inquisitive and focus on listening rather than sharing, which can definitely be a viable way to learn. Then it says, don't expect others to provide links to research proving that bias exists or summaries of best practices. Do your own research to seek out relevant information. Now, I'm all for listening and getting people's opinions, but not asking for sources to back up someone's opinions isn't scholarship. It's being a listener. I'm down to be a listener when I want to, but scholarship needs to have sources, studies, and pushback. I don't expect others to have sources in casual conversations, but when it comes down to it, and I have sources and the other ally scholar doesn't, then that scholar isn't worth their weight in salt. Now maybe I'm just being way too critical of a couple of fluff documents. Even if these people believe this, it can't be that bad, right? Well, let me show you a clip of Tim Pool, who quotes the guy who wrote the book on anti-racism.
Over on Instagram, I posted this. It is an image from a Cartoon Network PSA for children. It says, see color, be anti-racist. Most people see the phrase anti-racist, and they assume it means don't be racist. I'm sorry, that's not true. I have a quote for you from a prominent anti-racist explaining what anti-racism is. In this quote from Ibram X. Kendi, he says, the defining question is whether the discrimination is creating equity or inequity. If discrimination is creating equity, then it is anti-racist. If discrimination is creating inequity, then it is racist. The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. This is a quote from a prominent anti-racist author saying that you must discriminate against people based on their race in order to create favorable outcomes.
So according to the anti-racist movement, which is part of critical race theory, current discrimination is the way to fix past discrimination. And this guy's book has spent 21 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Another best-selling book, White Fragility, has made the rounds as well, and its author, Robin DiAngelo, explains in her own words on The Tonight Show what it's all about.
Dr. Robin DiAngelo, thank you so much for doing The Tonight Show. I really appreciate it. I know how busy you are, and everyone wants to talk to you right now, so this means a lot to me. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And thank you so much for having me.
Your book, White Fragility, why it's so hard for white people to talk about racism. This came out in 2018.
Yes,
and it's been on the bestseller list ever since then.
it has. Yes.
And right now, it is number one on all the lists I looked at, and it's also from what I read, it's sold out everywhere as well. The term "white fragility," did you coin that term? Did you come up with that, or is that it?
I did.
What does it? What does it mean for exactly?
Well, the fragility part is meant to capture how little it takes to cause white people to melt down in defensiveness and umbrage. I mean, we make it so miserable for Black people to talk to us about what they're experiencing from us that most of the time they just don't. It's not worth it. It tends to get worse, not better. Wow. And so in that way, white fragility is quite powerful, and it protects the racial status quo.
Could you help me in a way? I want to ask a question. Like, how does one say, how does a white person say that they're not racist?
Well, white people often say, I'm not racist. I know you have, I have done things in my life I recognize as racist today. I would not do them again. They were neither intentional or even conscious, and yet they wounded other people nonetheless. I think white people should remove that phrase from their vocabulary. I'm not racist. It's not, trust me, it's not convincing to Black people. As long as we define racism as individual, intentional acts of meanness, then I would agree with you that most white people are not racist. But when I'm talking about the racism that I have, the racism that you have, it's the result of living in a society in which racism is the foundation. We all absorb it. We all absorb it. There's no way we could exempt ourselves from it. And so we need to change our question from if I'm racist, to which most white people will say no, yep, to how have I been shaped by the forces of racism I was born into, and how is it manifesting in my life? It's a really different question. Yeah. But if I ask if, and the answer is no, what further action is required of me to challenge racism? Nothing. I'm not racist. If I ask, how have I been shaped and what is it looking like in my life? Well, that sets me on a lifelong process. And I can just tell you, look around at the society, white people thinking we're not racist is not and has not ended racism. We have to change our paradigm. We can never be complacent.
So where can white people start?
I would say start with asking yourself this question: what does it mean to be white? Most white people can't answer that question. And if I can't hold what it means to be white, I cannot hold what it means not to be white. And I'm going to have no critical thinking on this topic, no skills to navigate this uncomfortable conversation, and no emotional capacity to withstand how uncomfortable the conversation is. And that means Black people can't be their authentic selves with us.
So the big takeaways are that white people are inevitably racist, it takes very little for white people to melt down, and racism doesn't mean intentional acts of meanness, but it should mean the racism we absorb from the foundations of our society. And we need to define whiteness. This is why the documents I quoted earlier concern me. Critical race theory is making its way into the mainstream. Like recently, there was a LinkedIn course based on D'Angelo's work that had slides such as this encouraging people to be less white, and giving these specific ways on how to be less white. It's nasty stuff. Here I'd like to introduce some people who have been fighting against critical theory. I'm mostly going to be taking clips from James Lindsay. For those of you who don't know him, here's a short introduction.
To be clear up front, we think studying topics like gender, race, and sexuality is worthwhile, and getting it right is extremely important. The problem is how these topics are being studied right now. A culture has developed in which only certain conclusions are allowed, like those that make whiteness and masculinity problematic. The fields we're concerned about put social grievances ahead of objective truth. So as a simple summary, we call the problem grievance studies. To test the depth of this problem, my collaborators and I dedicated ourselves to a 1 to 2 year secret project targeting top grievance studies journals with an agreement to publicly release our findings, no matter what the outcome. This is deeply concerning, because the work of grievance scholars goes on to be taught in classes, to design educational curricula, to be taken up by activists, to influence how media is produced, and to misinform journalists and politicians about the true nature of our cultural realities.
Recently, James Lindsay has been working on a website called New Discourses, and here's a clip from Karlin Borisenko quoting his website to define what critical race theory is.
Critical race theory begins with a cynical view that race is the predominant structural element of America and other societies, and that all analysis of race must incorporate systemic power, which is to say systemic racism. This, it insists, is everywhere, ordinary, permanent, and mostly and badly hidden. A kind of racism that is just beneath the surface. So see also code, mask, internalized dominance, internalized oppression, and internalized racism. One duty of the critical race theorist is to expose this hidden racism wherever it can be found. And folks, if you start looking for racism absolutely everywhere, trust me, you will find it absolutely everywhere.
So here's where I really disagree with critical race theory and related terms, because I don't think that inequality and unfairness can or should be boiled down to simply race and racism. Dave Silverman said a similar thing in this clip, and he says it better than me.
People are different. There's not a lot of Jews in the NFL, and it's not because of rabid anti-Semitism. Okay, there's not a lot of Jews in the NBA, and it's not because of rabid anti-Semitism. It's because people are different, and that's okay. Groups of people are different, and that's okay. Nobody's better or worse. It's not about better or worse. It's about different. They choose different, they act different, and that is one of the reasons that we have inequity in this world. And inequity, therefore, is not a problem. It's not a problem. Inequity is only a problem if it is the result of bigotry, racism. And I don't even like to use the word racism because the word is gone. If it's bigotry, we as a society have the responsibility to fix it. But if the inequity is a result of different people wanting different things, then the problem is that the people who want then the problem is that we just want people to make different free choices.
Right.
And if the problem is that we just want people to make different free choices, that makes it our problem, not society's.
So why is there such a problem with critical race theory? Because so many people use words in different ways from others. This goes back to the documents I cited at the beginning, as well as D'Angelo's telling people that they should redefine what it means to be racist. When a group is actively trying to redefine words, people can't have useful conversations because everyone talks past each other. And when it comes down to words and their definitions, I've heard many people use words associated with critical race theory, such as systemic racism, antiracism, or white fragility. But they don't know about or say they agree with the ideas of CRT. But even if they don't endorse CRT, they are espousing its tenets, and I'm not a fan. Because I think critical race theory is racist. And I'm not alone, as seen in this next clip from an interview with James Lindsay.
What happened in the 1600s was that white people put social significance of racial superiority and inferiority into the categories of white and black. And then we unleashed a monster doing that, and it took us 3 centuries or more, almost 4 centuries, to fight back against that. We had to bear on the question scientifically, we had to bear on the question ethically, we had to bear on the question religiously, we had to bear on the question just about every way that you can possibly imagine. Finally, we achieve abolition. Finally, we write the Declaration of Independence, actually, and all men are created equal. And there we lay the seeds. We write the Constitution, and there the seed is planted. And finally, almost 100 years later, we get abolition. Finally, almost 100 years after that, we get rid of segregation and Jim Crow. We finally, 30 years after that, 40 years after that, have used comedy and social discourse and the interactions between everyday people to have brought racism down to a low simmer at the worst. We've really made some progress undoing the mistake of, just to put a fake date on it, 1650. And then I said, Helen, these critical race theorists made the same mistake. They put social significance back into racial categories. They said it is important to distinguish the sentence, "I am black," and this is quoting Kimberly Crenshaw, who is credited as the founder of intersectionality and the co-founder of critical race theory. She said, "It is important that we distinguish between the sentences, 'I am black' and 'I am a person who happens to be black.'" And her problem with "I am a person who happens to be black" is it centers their universal humanity rather than their race, which would be useful for identity politics. So that's reinventing the same mistake of 1650 that took us 3.5 centuries to undo the ravaging damages of.
I agree with Lindsay. I don't think we should put social significance of superiority and inferiority in categories of white and black. There are definite problems with racism. There always have been, and there always will be as long as we live in a free society. But I think it's a horrible mistake to look at the world in terms of race and racism before looking at the world in terms of people. The problem with seeing people as their race or skin color first, as critical theory does, is that we get conundrums like this situation that Lindsay presents.
This is how critical race theory, since it's so popular, you need to understand, this is how it analyzes a situation. So I want you to envision for a moment that you run a shop or a store, something like a tailor shop, something where you have to come out and work one-on-one for a number of minutes with each customer as they come in, and through whatever set of circumstances, you're working alone that day, you're behind the counter, the bell rings, the door opens, and in very short order, 2 people enter before you can react, but not in a way where you have the impression that they're together. They just happen to arrive roughly at the same time, and one of these people is white and one of these people is black. You're the only one there, so you have to make a zero-sum decision of who you help first, the white person or the black person. Now, the fundamental assumption of critical race theory is that these systems of power are immanent. They are everywhere. They are always. They are permanent. And they bear on every social interaction, every phenomenon. They are present in everything. That is the fundamental operating assumption of critical race theory. So the question, as our friend Robin DiAngelo put it, is not, did racism take place? It is, how did racism manifest in that situation? That's a quote. She's given this quote multiple times, both in writing and in speech. The question is not, did racism take place, but how did racism manifest in that situation? Racism is to be assumed. So you now have your choice. Anybody in here want to go to the white person first? What a shock. Not a single one. Bunch of racists. So you're racist. You're all racists. You're all racist. You know why you're racist? Because you think black people can't be trusted to be left alone in that store for a few minutes while you help another customer. You think they might steal something. Or maybe you actually wanted to help the white person. You really did. But you didn't want to be seen helping a white person first. So you had to perform. You had to pretend that you're anti-racist. Your decision was riddled with racism. The question was not, did racism take place? It was, how did it manifest in that situation? And it's that you don't trust black people and you wanted to get them out. You racist. Anybody want to pick the white person now? Still no. Amazing. Pause. Think about what that means. Nobody wants to pick the white person first. That's the very definition of bias, by the way. Every single one of you somehow intuit that in this new world, a colorblind choice was wrong. None of you want to help the white person first. Well, that's good, because that would be racist too, by the way. Of course, because racism, of course, must be present. It's not, did it take place, but how did it manifest in that situation? And it's obviously because you saw white people as first-class citizens, black people as second-class citizens who have to wait. Or maybe you just prefer working with members of your own race first if you're white, or maybe it's that you, any number of things. This is the way that these woke critical theories analyze the world. Why? Because one, the systemic idea of power must be present in all things. The job of the critical theorist is to make it visible and to agitate for social activism around it, like burning your store down later after they put it on social media, what a racist you were. And three, because truth doesn't matter. There is no truth. Objective truth doesn't matter. Even if we were to ask, well, what was your motivation? Why did you choose as you chose? Doesn't matter. Even if it could be shown by some test that you were absolutely true, doesn't matter. There's probably some implicit bias at work. Truth doesn't matter. Impact, not intent. The impact was racist because somebody was able to write racism into the story, and that's all it takes. This is the woke ideology. Everything must be analyzed through power in this way. In other words, everything must be reduced to a simple understanding, a cartoonish understanding of systemic power that thinks that everything that happens intentionally must have racism in it, and that everything that happens that produces disparate outcomes, even if we can find no evidence of racism, must be the result of racism that is tucked somewhere in all the cracks and corners.
I think there are many issues in this world, including racism, and I think there is much that can and should be done to help our brothers and sisters. I don't think the critical race theory or any of the related concepts discussed here are the answer to ending racism. In fact, I think most of them sound nice but actively make the problem worse. I think the best person to ever talk about racism was Martin Luther King Jr., and his most famous speech is so iconic because he dreamed and called for people to look past skin color and to see every person as a child of God. And that's what we should all be striving for.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today